In 1953, a man named Alan Gant developed the first commercial stocking. He named them panty legs. By the early 60s, stockings had become a part of the fashion. A piece of clothing with such sexual attention is sooner or later going to draw out the nut jobs. I'm not here to talk about fashion. In 1962, the alleged Boston strangler murdered one of his elderly victims by strangling her with her stockings. A downhill slope from there. The 60s ended and the 70s began. The 70s holds a lot of cultural significance. We may very well live in the era of mass shootings and senseless outbursts of mayhem, but the 70s were different. The 1970s and the 1980s was the age of the serial killer, the deviant, the boogeyman. Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, Jeffrey Dahmer, and so on and so fucking forth. And it was early in the 1970s that another boogeyman was born, another deviant that preyed on the vulnerable. His name was Carlton Gary, but you may know him by his other name, the Stocking Strangler. Carlton Gary is not your typical run-of-the-mill serial killer, mainly because he is a black man. There's been a whole lot of black serial killers throughout the years, but they have always been heavily outnumbered by the white serial killers. Usually a black serial killer prefers to target black females, just as white serial killers like to target white females. But Carlton Gary had a very specific demographic that he liked to target. It was elderly white ladies. The only reason I'm telling you these things is simply to let you know that Carlton Gary is a rarity among rarities when it comes to serial killers and murderers in general. The year was 1970. Carlton Gary had barely settled in Albany when two disturbing reports came in. Two elderly ladies had been attacked in their homes. The order of the attack isn't clear to me, but one of the victims died and the other survived. Nellie Farmer was 85 years old when she was attacked in her own home. The retired 85-year-old schoolteacher had been severely beaten, she had been raped, and she had been choked to death by her attacker. Afterwards, her apartment was robbed and ransacked. What kind of sick person could do something so horrible to someone so defenseless? But there was another victim. Her name was Josephine Dietz, and she told police that she had been attacked in her home by a black man. He had beaten her, raped her, and then he had tried to strangle her. He must have thought that he had finished the job, but he hadn't, and Josephine survived. Police investigated the attacks fiercely. They needed to find the man responsible for these attacks, That's when they found Carlton Gary. They linked him to a fingerprint found in Nellie Farmer's apartment. They thought they had him, but Carlton was never really a stupid person. He had an intellect and IQ above average, and he somehow managed to blame the murder on an accomplice he had brought with him. He confessed to robbing Nellie Farmer's apartment, but told police that his accomplice had beaten, raped, and murdered the lady. Lucky for Carlton, his accomplice was charged with the murder, and Carlton himself was only locked up for 5 years for the robbery. He had the sociopathic abilities and tendencies of an efficient serial killer. And even if the murder of Nellie Farmer isn't officially proven to have been committed by Carlton Gary, I do believe that his actions in the years that followed confirms that Nellie Farmer was indeed Carlton Gary's first victim, and she certainly would not be the last. Some years had gone by when Carlton Gary was released from prison in 1975. He had only been locked up for 5 years, but there was a built-up need within him. The rape and murder of 85-year-old Nellie Farmer had started something. That's probably why he went outside his usual MO and acted more on pure impulse. Her name was Muriel Fisher, and she was a 40-year-old educational teacher in Syracuse. It was on the night of June 27th that Marion angrily left her home to go to the local bar. She had had a falling out with her husband Jack, and it was when she was walking home from the bar that the stranger stalking her attacked. He raped her and choked her to death right there, out in the open. It would take many years for police to link Carlton Gary to the murder of Muriel Fisher, and for years her husband Jack was held as the likeliest suspect, to such an extent that his children were taken away from him. But then they finally tested the DNA they had found on a red towel near the crime scene, and lo and behold, it matched the DNA of Carlton. But by that time he had already been caught for 6 other murders that would follow in the years after Muriel Fisher. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. Carlton clearly had a thing for older women. Marion was his youngest victim, and she had been killed on the street. It was almost as if Carlton Gary had been on a dry streak and needed to wet his beak before he could think clearly again. But it would take a while. It would take a while for him to commit his next attack. It wasn't until December 31st, 1976 that he acted again. This time he broke into a 59-year-old woman's home and raped her in her own bed. Afterwards he tried to strangle her to death with a pillowcase, but luckily enough he wasn't successful. She survived, and maybe that is what caused Carlton Gary to act again so quickly. His next victim was 55-year-old Jean Frost. He attacked her only a few days after the attack on the 59-year-old woman. It was in the middle of the night on January 3rd, 1977. 55-year-old Jean Frost woke up and saw a dark figure stand at the doorway. The dark figure all of a sudden moved quickly to the bed and jumped on top of Jean. She desperately tried to wiggle herself free of the man, but he held her down, and with ferocity he ripped her nightgown off and shoved it into her mouth. "You shouldn't have struggled," he told Jean, as he kept landing blow after blow to her head, one fist right after another. Then he took a scarf and began strangling her. Eventually she passed out, and when she finally woke up, she felt severe pain in her vagina and saw that there was blood covering the bedsheets. Her house had also been robbed, and she told police that a black man with a mustache had attacked her. It was on the next day that Carlton Gary and an associate of his was arrested, trying to convert collectible coins into cash at a local bank. Police brought him in and found a gold watch stolen from Jean Frost in his possessions. But once again he told police that his accomplice had raped and attempted to murder the woman. And once again, With no physical linking the assault to Carlton Gary and his narrative of only being a lookout, he wasn't charged with attempted murder or sexual assault. But he was again shipped to prison for breaking his parole violation. Twice he had gotten away with the same story. He sat in his cell for 8 months, but he just wasn't done yet, and he knew he had to get out. He needed a proper fix. So on August 22nd, Carlton Gary escaped from prison and quickly made his way south, to his home state of Georgia. Death had arrived in Columbus, Georgia. Carlton Gary knew he was free for a limited time, but he had the desires. The forces in his head that drove him now was on the prowl. Barely a month after his escape, he struck an affluent suburban home in Columbus, Georgia. It was the night of September 15, 1977, and Fernie Jackson, 60 years old, was home in her bed. No one knew what had happened to Fernie, so when she didn't show up for work the next day, authorities were contacted to check on her, just to see if everything was alright. It wasn't like her to be absent without contacting the colleagues at the health department. Police did their check, but I doubt they were prepared for what they were about to see. When they walked into the bedroom, they could see Fernie Jackson laying on the bed. She had a stocking tied tightly around her bruised neck, and she had a pillow over her face. She had been raped and strangled to death. Police found hair on the scene that indicated the killer to be a black man, but as to not stir up any racial tensions, they decided to keep the evidence away from the public. Only a few days after the murder of Fernie Jackson, another lady was attacked. She had been raped, beaten and strangled, but she had survived and was hospitalized, unable to speak. The citizens of Columbus was getting increasingly worried. Someone appeared to be preying on them. Jean Diamondstein was one of them. She was one of the citizens that expressed her fear and worry of the attacks that had occurred. She was 71 years old, but spry and happy. Little did she know that she would be next. It was September 25th, only 10 days after his arrival in Columbus. He was outside Jean Diamondstein's home. He silently removed the hinge pins to her door and made his way into her bedroom. Then he got on top of her, and as she woke up, he began to repeatedly punch her in the face. He landed punch after punch, bruises and blood. Then he raped her. She hadn't died yet, but she was barely conscious from the punches she had received. Then Carlton Gary owned up to his new nickname as the Stocking Strangler when he grabbed a nylon stocking and wrapped it tightly around Jean's neck and strangled her to death. Watching her bruised and bloody face as her consciousness sunk into the void. The people of Columbus, especially the older women, couldn't contain it anymore. Someone was hunting them, and no one was safe. Police took action though, and set up roadblocks and stakeouts in hopes of finding this elusive serial killer. But Carlton Gary must have been scared. All this tension, he couldn't risk anything while everyone was still so worked up. Then on October 2nd, another man, Jerome Livas, was arrested for the rape and murder of a 55-year-old woman. He had not strangled her to death, he had beaten her to death. But police saw a similarity in the choice of victims and the fact that he had so savagely raped and murdered her. The man soon confessed to the murders of Jean Diamondstein and Fernie Jackson. Everyone was so fucking relieved. Finally, they thought, the monster that had been stalking them was caught. It was safe now. Or so they thought. Carlton Gary again felt that he could operate safely. Now the police had arrested someone else for the murders he had committed, so no one knew that he was still out there, still preying on them. October 21st, 1977. He had only been on the run for 2 months, but he was already a prolific monster. It was broad daylight, and Florence Schaible, almost 90 years old, was listening to the radio in her home. She was 10 days shy of 90, but she would never live past the age of 89. Carlton Gary, the stalking strangler, broke into her home. She couldn't see him though, as Florence Schaible was blind, and she couldn't move away either, as she couldn't move without using her walker. Carlton Gary didn't seem to mind that at all. He just started beating her, punching the old and frail lady in the face. Then he started dragging her to the bed, where he raped her, and finally took a stocking and wrapped it around her neck. Even though she was barely alive at that point, he wanted to make sure, and it had become his ritual of sorts. Police were baffled. What the fuck was going on? Had they caught the wrong guy? Confused, police soon realized that they had made a huge mistake. The man they had arrested wasn't a serial killer at all. He was a compulsive liar and confessed to all manners of murder, including the assassination on JFK. In other words, he was fucking crazy. Florence Schaible had only been dead for 2 days when the strangler struck again. He was on a run, and he didn't want to stop. Her name was Martha Thurmond, a 69-year-old retired school teacher. Martha's relatives were concerned for her when she couldn't contact them, so they alerted police. Again, police did a checkup, and again, police stumbled upon a tragic scene. As they walked into the bedroom, they saw Martha Thurmond's corpse laying on the bed. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Her face was blue, and her eyes were staring blankly into the void. Police had to act. This guy was insane. He was like a machine as he kept attacking the women. But the task force they were setting up had barely began their operation when the strangler struck again, murdering a wealthy 77-year-old socialite named Kathleen Woodruff. He had beaten, raped, and strangled the wealthy old lady to death. Then, just as the task force picked up steam, the strangler disappeared. He was gone for a couple of months, just enough time to get the people of Columbus to lower their shields. Her name was Ruth Shuang, and she was a very successful and wealthy lady. She had been president of a company and had at one point been voted as Columbus Woman of the Year. She was 74 years old but very spry. She jogged and trained in judo. It was on the night of February 11, 1978, that the stalking strangler broke into Ruth Schwab's home. She woke up and saw a black man hover over her face, and just as he was about to grapple her throat, she managed to press her panic button that alerted her neighbor, who called the police. She fought fearlessly with her attacker. Police arrived on the scene and the strangler had disappeared. He had fled from the scene, but Ruth was still alive. She was gasping for air, clawing at her throat with a stocking tied tightly around her neck. As police loosened the stocking, she threw up. But she survived. The ambulance arrived and reported that they had seen a black man matching the description of Ruth's attacker run through the yards in the neighborhood. But they weren't able to catch him just yet. Carlton Gary hadn't achieved his climax. He was full of rage and hatred. He needed another fix. Barely 24 hours had passed by after the attack when he targeted 78-year-old Mildred Dismukes. She was a widow, and at some point the strangler had broken in and tried to rape her. She had put up a fierce fight, and I really mean fierce. The crime scene was such a mess that even an experienced homicide detective burst into tears. She had fought for her life, but ultimately the stalking strangler had overpowered her. He had taken a cord from a Venetian blind to strangle her to death. Reports of this magnitude breeds nutjobs. Nutjobs that wants to come out of the woodwork. After the murder of Mildred, a letter arrived at the police station. It claimed that they were a white supremacist group that held a black woman captive, and that for every white lady that was murdered, they would kill a black lady. But that was a lie. It was actually another serial killer in a nearby town that was trying to blame one of his own victims, Gail Jackson, an elderly black woman, on a white supremacist group he had made up. He was a black man and confessed to have killed 2 more elderly black women. The racial shit, the tension and all that is kind of inescapable, which is kind of sad in a way, because it takes away from the true story, and from the lives that was lost, and from the mind that was capable of such atrocities to begin with. Some time went by when the strangler reared his ugly head once again. It was on April 19 that he attacked 61-year-old Janet Kofer. She usually had her son with her, but unfortunately, he wasn't there that night. Carlton Gary broke into her home. He raped her and strangled her, another victim added to the list. But she would be his last murder victim. After this, he went on a crime spree. He didn't murder during his spree, he was robbing restaurants, and he did commit rapes all over Georgia, Florida and South Carolina. He had become an outlaw, a bandit. Then Carlton Gary was caught again, but there was still an issue. No one knew that he was the stalking strangler, but he was sentenced to 21 years in prison, and after 4 years he escaped again, and he again fled to Columbus. That's when police in Columbus finally got the break they were looking for, as they matched Carlton Gary's fingerprints to a fingerprint found on one of the crime scenes. But he was still on the run, committing robberies and just evading capture in general. He was a very dangerous individual, but mainly dangerous to older women. But for some reason, his lust to kill seemed to have simmered down after his string of murders in 1977 and 1978. It was now 1984. Police knew that he was responsible for the murders, and they got a tip on where he was. They sent out a SWAT force to capture the elusive career criminal, and finally they fucking had him. The stalking strangler was identified and sentenced to death. There was an appeal in 2009 when he was about to be executed. Just 4 hours before the execution, it was stopped. It was considered whether he had been falsely accused, but his DNA was found at 2 of the murders, the murder of Jean Diamondstein and Muriel Fisher. He again was sentenced to death, and his execution was carried out. His execution was carried out on March 15, 2018. He was 67 years old when the lethal injection killed him. And so ends the story of Carlton Gary. I would like to thank you all for sticking with me during my first year on YouTube. A year ago I was just beginning and had about 2 subscribers. Now I have all of you, and I'm really fucking grateful for that. And you know what? I'm just getting started.